This video will show a Lightroom workflow when using Bob DiNatale's one-zone method of digital exposure. Bob's method supports the advantage of exposure to the right. The benefits of exposing to the right will produce a file with less noise, more tonal data, sharper images, and less processing artifacts. The modified one-zone workflow is based on bracketed exposures. The bracketed exposures should be in 2/3 of a stop increments. The base exposure is set to plus 1 1/3 stops EV. This should result in 3 exposures, plus 1 1/3 stop EV, the second exposure to be plus 2/3 EV, and the third exposure plus 2 EV. Note the sequence. If you can set the sequence order to be the base exposure, then minus or plus, it will benefit you in your Lightroom workflow. One of these 3 exposures will be the most optimum and produce the best digitally processed image. The modified one-zone method consists of making a set of 3 bracketed exposures. At first, importing 3 bracket exposures per scene may seem a little overwhelming. A day's shoot of 20 scenes will produce 60 files. Yes, and 100 scenes will produce 300 files. However, this one-zone Lightroom workflow will help. Using Lightroom stacking features, you can collapse these bracketed exposures so you are viewing the same number of shots. If you're not familiar with Lightroom stacking, it is a powerful tool. As you can see from this Lightroom screen, these are 3 bracketed sets. Okay, and let's take a look at the next set of 3. The first one will be 1 1/3 stops. Now I want you to notice here, I want you to notice the histogram. And that is exposing to the right. And if I go to the next one, which is a little less exposure, you'll see the histogram become more to the left. And of course, if I go to my 2 stops over, I'm really slamming it up against the right side. So I guess I'm going to do this one more time. Well, let me pick this set of 3, just to drive home the point. This is my base exposure of 1 1/3 stops over the camera's recommended exposure. Let's take a look at the next image. This is the 2/3 of a stop, overexposed. And the final image looks pretty overexposed to us. And again, this is 2 EV. I'll go through them again. Here is the first of the bracketed set. This is 1 1/3 stops EV plus. Notice the histogram. Then this is the 2/3 overexposure, or plus 2/3. It looks pretty good. And finally, the one that's overexposed. So, again, to look through all of these could be a little tedious. As I said, if we understand Lightroom stacking, these 3 belong to the same group. You could always go to the menu, Photos, Stacking, Group in a Stack. But I find right mouse clicking will always present you with your stacking option. Let me unstack this for a second. Okay, so what I want you to notice is that there are 60 photos Now, I only really took 20 scenes. However, with our 3 bracketed exposures, I have 60 images, which can be a little overwhelming, but here comes the power of Lightroom. I can right mouse click, go to my stacking option, and if I go all the way down, there's something that says auto stack by time. So when I press this, if I go to 1 second, it shows that I will have 20 stacks and there'll be 0 unstacked. When I click stack, I want you to notice that now these brackets all have little shields in front of them. It says photo is part of a stack. Photo is part of a stack. Photo is part of a stack. Now, working with stacks, all I have to do is click the first in the group, and the stack will collapse. If I click it again, it will open up. Click it, it closes. Click it, it opens up. Now, this can be a little tedious if you have hundreds of photos. So again, by right mouse clicking and say stacking, collapse all stacks. I want you to notice now that down here it no longer says just 60 photos. It says 20 of 60 photos. Again, right mouse clicking, go down to stacking, expand all stacks, and you can see every one of the exposures. Let me select all, and then let me right mouse click and go to my stacking and say unstack. Now at this point, I should be back to where I was. 60 images, edit, deselect active photo, repeat the auto stacking again. I can simply right mouse click to address my stacking function. I can go down and say auto stack by time, and again I usually choose 1 second, and you'll notice the shields show on the brackets. So all I have to do is say stack. It's created these stacks by time. I'm going to right mouse click. I'm going to say collapse all stacks. And now I'm looking at the 20 scenes that I shot. As I said, editing your one zone bracketed exposure stacks is similar to your normal Lightroom selection workflow, except you are selecting one zone bracket stacks instead of individual images. Now, how do you choose the best exposure of the stacks? Because again, our intent is to get the optimum exposure. And if I look at this histogram, I want to expose to the right without losing information off the right side of the histogram. Let me make the thumbnails a little larger here so we can see this. Let me select these 3, and if we look at the first exposure, then we look at the second exposure, the histogram moves to the left, and the third exposure, which is the brightest, will move to the right. Now, choosing the best exposure from a histogram is very difficult. We can use Lightroom's develop mode to assist us here. If I look at my first exposure, and my second exposure, and my third exposure, we can see that the histogram moves just as it did before. However, we can turn on the highlight warning. And what the highlight warning does is, when we start getting an exposure that clips off the end of the histogram, the red appears. So, if I look at my group, remember, I'll click this to close it. When I evaluate these exposures with the clipping on, which you can turn on with the mouse here, or you could hit the letter J, a keyboard shortcut, turns both the highlights and the shadows warning on. Okay, if the shadows get too dark, it'll show up blue once it clips off the left side of the histogram. And if the exposure goes off the right side of the histogram, the red warnings occur. So using the highlight clipping will tell us what is our optimum exposure. Usually when I evaluate these, I'll look at the first exposure. If I do not see any red warning, I will click on the stack to expand it. I'll go not to my next one, because certainly if I didn't see it on the first image, I will not see any clipping on the underexposed image. But if I go to this exposure here, this looks like getting a little clipping. Now, in the sky like this, it may be good, but let's go back to our first image and say, this is the one we want. Now, initially, this may look like an overexposure, but we know that we've lost no data in our exposure. So what we're going to do here is we're going to click Auto Tone. There are lots of good reasons to use Auto Tone. That'll be for another video, but it will optimize the Lightroom Process Version 2012 adaptive algorithms. What I then usually do is I can move the slider bar, the exposure slider bar, till I get a good global exposure. We've already worked from the top down by using the auto exposure. Very interesting video by Jack Davis where he says the first slider he addresses after exposure is clarity. Now, I'm working on a reasonable exposure here, but I'm not sure about my white balance. Usually the white balance would be one of the first things you want to adjust because it does affect the exposure. So let me pick the white paint using the white balance, and you see that I've really changed. I'll bring my history tab. It's made an effect, and if you notice, it's also changed where the black point is. But now if I look at this, I may want to increase my contrast, increase my vibrance, and maybe take the highlights just down a little. Oh, I see something's happening in the sky. I'll take my black exposure because I see a little, maybe too much of it here. I'll take my black exposure here. And one of the things I may do is hold down the corners of my picture, and you'll probably notice the edges. In the Lightroom presets that came with Lightroom, they have a vignette 1, and this kind of works pretty nicely. Did you see that effect on there? Let me go back to my history and remove it. Okay. My intent here is to not show you the processing, but more show you how to select the best exposure in the one zone stack. So let me go to my next stack. And here's an exposure. And this is the first one. As you can see here, it has an EV of 1 1/3 stops overexposed. This is my base exposure. There is no predicting which one will be the best exposure because it depends on the subject that the camera meter is looking at. So let me open the stack. This one is a little too bright, so I know there's no need for me to look at the more exposed one, because the more exposed one certainly won't help me. So if I look at it, the second one looks fine. I have made my digital capture exposed to the right as far as I can. Here is my base, plus 1 1/3 EV, and here is my underexposed, that's 2/3. So recently I've been working here with the Show Lab colors. And when I go up here, I have 97, 98, 97%, 98.1, 98.2. I have definitely made my exposure as far right as I can without going to the histogram. So now, in this set of bracketed exposures, the exposure that is 2/3 of a stop overexposed is the best. So here's what I'm going to do. If I go to the second exposure, which is the one I'm on, you'll notice if I roll over it, I'll see a shield. If I click the shield, it jumps to the first position. Now when I click the first position, it collapses, and now I have the best exposure on the top of my stack. Matter of fact, I may give this a pick because I like what I'm doing here, and so this will be a pick. Now this is the one I'll process, and as I say, there's lots of benefits. First of all, there's noise. Take a look at this. You see very little noise in the black here. That's only because the black isn't black. This black is far from being black. However, I can take my general overall exposure down. Now, maybe I'll use Jack Davis's. I'll go here. I will choose a white point. Now, when I choose a white point or try to feel for color, I mean, this looks a little cool, so I can bring it up with the yellow. However, just as a start, I'm going to use this as a shot. So I will try to see if there's a neutral. And generally, there's always a neutral. And this will bring it back to a good exposure. I'm going to go to my crop tool. I'm going to use the ruler for the angle and just draw it right along the water line here. Okay, straighten that up. I think my color temperature was pretty good. I'll warm it up a little bit more, come up with the clarity, punch it a little bit. Certainly, always go back. I probably use this in many situations. By the way, this vignette is affecting this slider here. If you watch these numbers, by clicking this, it'll always be 15. And you can moderate that if you think it's too much, increase it. You can do the roundness. There's lots of things you can do with the feather. But just selecting this is a good place to start. If I look here, I may, because this is a colorful scene, I may bring up the vibrance a little. And I don't see any blacks. I like to leave the highlight warning on because now if I go down to here, you'll see, I think the first black starts appearing in the tires of the tugboat. And now I just may take my highlights down a little bit, bring a little bit of sky in there. I could work more on the sky. Maybe I'll put a gradient. And let's see if I can focus a little more on the boat. Maybe get a brush. Every time I use the brush, what I like to do is show the mask. Make sure my density is up here. And this way, it's kind of nice. I can see where I'm drawing. Now, I usually make a quick mask to see if the effect is worthwhile. And if it is, then I will go back and refine the mask. But let me shut this off now. And let me see what a little more exposure to the tugboat does. Maybe go a little bit more here. And raise the shadows a little bit here. Maybe a tad more clarity. A little less contrast to get it. Now is when I probably will shut off my warnings because I want to see where this black occurs. And now I think I'll stop there. What I want to show you is how it was imported. Look at the exposure to the right and the final update. Okay. Again, I might add a new brush, turn this on, and just make this area here snap just a little more. What I'm showing you is not the processing per se, but I'm showing you the power of exposing to the right. Because if I do this, I'll shut this off. If I zoom in, you're not going to see any noise. Let's do one more. Now my first exposure here looks like I'm getting a lot of overexposure. I'm off the right of the histogram. However, this is reflection. And sometimes specular highlights are light sources are acceptable for red clipping. But let me open this up and let me just look at the exposure below it. Now, in the exposure below it, this looks pretty good because, again, this is just highlight warnings. It shows clipping in one channel. I know there's no reason to even look at the one that's 2 stops overexposed because this is really off the histogram. Here's the first one. And this one here, it's going to be great because, again, specular reflection should show clipping. So let me go here and click on the photo that's number 2 in the stack. It moves it to number 1. Let's go ahead and process this through our normal ways. First thing we do is auto tone. The next thing I do, you can move the slider here, kind of like to move the slider up here. Now, you'll notice here was the way we imported it. As soon as I hit auto tone, Lightroom increased the contrast, took the exposure down automatically, but somehow it looks like we've lost our highlights. Well, they were captured properly. This is the auto tone exposure, and I'm just going to go ahead and try to adjust an average exposure. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to see if I can find a white balance. I'm going to try again the gray street, and you can see that certainly did 2 things. It really took the blue out of this winter scene, and it certainly affected the top end of my exposure. Now that I do this, let me take this highlight down a little more. Look at the buildings up here. I'm getting a lot of nice detail. And now, of course, you know where I'm going. I'm going to see what this vignette 1 looks like. Or maybe a little strong there, so I'm going to go back down here. Now I have 2 options. I can decrease the amount. And sometimes if you change the priority from highlight to color, you see it subtly minimizes the effect. And I just may pull it back just a little. We're going to just move along quickly here. You can make any kind of adjustments you want. I'm going to just bring up the vibrance a little. I kind of like what's happening in the building. And I think what I want to do is, let's see if I can just do it with some sort of gradient. Okay, I'm going to take the highlights down and see how I can bring that in. And I don't like the cool blue. I'm going to desaturate this. Now, I think it looks silly if it's all black and white and gray. So I'm just going to bring it back to a comfortable level. And I may just see if I want to bring the detail in the building a little more over here. And let me close the brush. And I'll just boost up my clarity here to get a nice little snap. Sometimes when I boost up the clarity, I either need to lower the contrast a little or just raise my shadow detail a little, and we'll stop here. But before we end, let me go back and show our history from what was imported. This is the optimum exposure. We've chosen it. We have exposed to the right as much as we can and add some processing techniques. I guess before I go, because I can never let it just finish, I'm going to use this auto lens correction. This is in Lightroom 5. It's a magical tool. And now, one more time, before and after. Hopefully, you can see the advantages of my modified 1 zone. We can make 3 exposures, bracketing our base, then plus or minus 2/3 of a stop, utilize the stacking feature, auto stack by time in Lightroom, usually selecting 1 second. You can hit stack, You can right mouse click to come back to the stacking menu. You can say collapse all stacks, and now go through your editing process as you normally do. I hope you found this interesting and you'll rethink the way you both capture your digital information and process it. Till the next time.